All right, folks, welcome back. Thanks for joining us this evening for Romney McPhee. I want to thank our sponsors, the Salish Sea Institute, Environmental Science Department, and the Alumni Association. Romney's going to be joining us online here, and Ginny Broadhurst, who's the director of the Salish Sea Institute, will give us a more complete introduction. Thanks, Ginny.
Hi, well, thanks, Xander, and welcome everybody in person and online today for the speaker series event. As Xander said, I'm director of the Salish Sea Institute. My name is Ginny Broadhurst. We run a minor in Salish Sea Studies. If you're not familiar with that, look it up. We're really happy to collaborate this quarter for this speaker series event in order to really focus on issues related to the Salish Sea, which requires us to bring in speakers from far away across the border. And so today we've got Romney McPhee, who works out of Vancouver Island. And so that means she's gonna not be in here in person, but be here virtually and save some, make her carbon footprint a little smaller. Romney McPhee is the science coordinator at the Tula Foundation. If you're not familiar with them, look them up and see the cool work that they're doing. She has a master's in science and marine biology. She has a bachelor's in science and environmental sciences, and she's been working for over 15 years on a whole variety of marine and coastal research. And as the Salish Sea Institute pulled together some folks who are interested and knowledgeable about basking sharks, it turns out that Romney is very well-versed and very passionate about basking sharks, just a super cool animal that have not really been seen much in the Salish Sea in the last couple decades. So excited to hear her presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to Romney. Thanks for being here, Romney.
Great. Thank you so much, Ginny. And thank you for inviting me to speak. So hello, everyone. I'm very privileged to be here today in Victoria, BC, which is on the traditional unceded territory of the Lekwungen peoples. And I'm very excited to be speaking to you today about an absolutely fascinating species that inhabits our shared waters and one of my personal favorite species of shark, the basking shark. So I wanted to start today's talk with a quote. "The great slaughter began at noon and continued for hours. We littered the beaches with their livers and the bottom with their carcasses. It was a colossal fight between the ship and the sea monsters, with the ship winning all the matches." So if I could see all of you, I would ask, what comes to mind when you hear this? Perhaps it's something like this, your traditional sea monster. Or maybe something like this. And this is actually a white shark, and I certainly don't want to vilify white sharks, but unfortunately, this species still comes to mind for many when we talk about sea monsters. What about this species? This gentle giant is probably not what comes to mind when you hear that quote. And I'll just pause for a second before I get into the presentation and let you appreciate this creature a little bit. And maybe you're asking yourself, why on earth would anyone want to slaughter this creature? So yes, this quote is about the slaughter of basking sharks. And this quote is actually from our recent history here in the Pacific Northwest. This quote was reported in the Vancouver Sun in 1956, so only 68 years ago. But before I get into this extremely sad part of our history with basking sharks, I wanted to lift you all up a little bit and tell you some more about this truly amazing species that, despite our best efforts, still inhabits our shared waters. So this afternoon, I'll be revealing the basking shark to you. I'm going to be talking about its remarkable biology and ecology. I'm going to be talking about our historical relationship with it, and I'm going to be talking about its current status here in the Northeast Pacific. And I'll also be speaking a little bit at the end to you about what we as a society here in the Salish Sea can do to turn the tide for the basking shark, both in the Salish Sea and beyond. So I personally have spent much of my time as a marine biologist thinking about, talking about, and attempting to study. And I say attempting because I have not actually seen a basking shark. So I've been attempting to study one of the largest and least understood creatures on our planet. And when I present on sharks in the Pacific Northwest, people are often amazed to hear that we have any sharks at all, let alone the second largest fish in the world. So along with being called gentle giants, basking sharks are now sometimes referred to as super sharks because of their large size and the fact they're pretty widely distributed. And when it comes to large sharks, basking sharks are a close second to their better known cousin, the whale shark. And they can get very big. So they can get to sizes of up to 12.2 meters or 40 feet. Sorry, I always start with meters because of the Canadian factor, but up to 40 feet, which in comparison is about the same size as a school bus. It's almost as big as a humpback whale, so a better known species that occupies waters up here in the Pacific Northwest. And in terms of weight, basking sharks can really reach an absolutely whopping size for a fish. So they can reach 6 to 7 tons in weight. That's larger than an African elephant, and it's about the same weight as a school bus. They have a huge liver, so their liver alone can weigh 1,000 pounds, and that's, again, with the Canadian reference, about as much as an adult male moose. So along with being distinguished by their size, basking sharks are also distinguished by how they feed. When we think of sharks, for better or for worse, we often think about teeth, but basking sharks only actually have these tiny little minuscule hook-like teeth. And they're so small that you can't even see them on this extreme close-up of a basking shark. And this is because basking sharks, one of the largest species in the world, feed almost exclusively on some of the smallest. And on the right side of the screen there is a calanoid copepod, which is one of the favored prey of basking sharks. And copepods don't get much larger than a grain of rice. So how do they capture this prey? Well, they capture them by filter feeding. Instead of using those minute little teeth, basking sharks used what are called modified gill rakers to capture their food. They have 5 external gill slits like most sharks, and I've shown that with the arrow there. And the gill rakers are actually the structures present on the internal gill slits, and they're actually modified skin cells on those gills. The gill slits are enormous, and that maximizes the surface area for those feeding structures. And you can see that there's really only a small amount of connective tissue at the top of the basking shark's head. It's a wonder they can actually keep their head on. But that, again, that's to maximize the feeding area, surface area. And then their mouths when they're feeding are enormous. So they can get up to 1 meter across when feeding. That's about the size of a toddler. Sorry, 3 feet, 1 meter, 3 feet. So really big. And so if you can imagine an adult basking shark, it's cruising along at a slow, constant speed of about 2 knots with its huge mouth open. It closes it periodically about every 30 to 60 seconds to ingest its filtered prey. And what's interesting, well, there's a lot that's interesting, but an interesting fact is that this differs from the other 2 filter feeding sharks in the world. So the whale shark and the megamouth shark, if you don't know the megamouth shark, look it up. They actively pump or gulp water to ingest their food, where the basking shark is much more similar to a small filter feeding fish, and that they rely on that passive flow of water over their gills to obtain their food. And as you can imagine, basking sharks need to feed a lot in order to get enough prey to sustain them. And another fun fact is that a single basking shark passes about 2,000 tons of water over its gills per hour. That's 500,000 liters, and it's equivalent to 4 Olympic-sized swimming pools of water. And food is really what we think brings them, well, we know, but we also think that that's what brings them to our waters. So our temperate coast is is very special in that it's extremely plankton rich in terms of both zooplankton and the phytoplankton on which the zooplankton feed. So basking sharks are thought to move hundreds of kilometers to come to our coast to eat. And historically, in the fall and winter, basking sharks occurred in hot spots off California. And then in spring and summer, they showed up on our coast when food was in abundance. And this seasonality is what has led us to believe that there's one single Northeast Pacific population that's moving seasonally between those waters. This seasonality appears to have changed based on recent work out of California, where they're seeing sharks in the summertime, but we don't know why. But regardless of the seasonal patterns, it's when basking sharks are in coastal waters that they're feeding and they're in need of prey. And those high concentrations of zooplankton are in areas where things like inlets or fronts between tidal masses or upwelling areas concentrate their prey to a density where they can meet their energy requirements. So even though they're called basking sharks, they are not actually sunbathing or basking. They do need the sun because the sun is what drives the growth of that phytoplankton upon which their zooplankton prey feed, but they're not basking in the sun. And it's when they're at the surface that they're visible to us. So these photos here show what they look like when they're at the surface typically. So like most sharks, they have that classic triangular dorsal fin. They have a kind of funny pointed snout that also sometimes sticks out of the water when they feed. And they have a big sort of crescent or moon-shaped caudal fin that also sometimes sticks out of the water. There in the bottom picture, you can see that when they're actively feeding. So what are they doing when they're not visible to us? Well, it turns out they like traveling. And traditionally, it was assumed that basking sharks the world over formed these distinct local populations in temperate areas. But some studies have indicated that the populations might not be as discrete as we thought, and that tropical waters aren't a barrier. So this study done in 2009 in the Atlantic, one shark F, you can see there on the left or right-hand side, was tagged off the coast of New England, but actually moved as far south as Brazil. And when in tropical waters, actually all of the tagged sharks were descending to depths, mesopelagic depths, so 200 to 1,000 meters. And in some cases, we're staying there for weeks to up to 5 months. So we don't know what they're doing at these depths, but it's thought that they might be reproducing down there and that those deep waters could provide stable conditions for gestation and parturition, as well as nursery habitat for neonates. What about up here in the Northeast Pacific? Well, recent tagging work off California shows that they also make large-scale movements in this ocean basin. In this study, 4 sharks were tagged and 2 moved pretty long distances. So one moved from the California coast to just off Baja, the shark in the top right there, and another shark moved to Hawaii. And they also showed sort of different vertical movement patterns depending on their location, and it was thought that was due to shifts in prey availability and oceanography. So studies like these also really highlight the need for global conservation efforts, and management needs to be considered in a global context for these populations to really thrive and survive. And this is challenging. Global conservation is a challenging thing. And then unfortunately for the basking shark, pretty much all of its innate life history characteristics make it quite vulnerable to decline. Some of the slow life history characteristics of the basking shark that make it vulnerable are a late age at maturity. So for females, it's about 16 to 20 years. They get old. We think about 40 to 50 years, maybe longer. They have a long gestation period of 1 to 3 years. That's one of the longest in the animal kingdom. And they have a very small litter size, 1 to 6 young. Although this is based on only 1 pregnant female ever encountered, and this was in 1936 in Norway. So that's interesting. And then they have a low natural mortality because they're so big, they don't have many natural predators. So all of these factors also contribute to a slow rate of population recovery after a decline has occurred. And unfortunately, declines have occurred. You're probably all wondering by now, okay, you've mentioned this Northeast Pacific population. Why have I never seen one? Why have I never even heard of a basking shark? And if they were here, why aren't they here anymore? Where did they go? So unfortunately for the basking shark and for us, the story of the basking shark in our waters is a really sad one to date, as I alluded to with that quote at the beginning of my presentation. So not long ago, there actually used to be lots of basking sharks on our coast in the spring and summer. There were so many of them, and sometimes groups of hundreds or more, that they would impede the passage of coastal steamers. And that was noted in a historical document in Alberta Inlet here on the west coast of Vancouver Island. A long history of exploitation on the coast, though, has resulted in the virtual disappearance of this amazing animal from our coast. This exploitation was really fueled by the media, misconceptions that were printed in the media. And this photo, for example, shows some sport fishermen off the west coast of Vancouver Island with a basking shark called, they've labeled it Monster of the Deep. And the caption ends by describing basking sharks as salmon killing monsters, which we now know obviously is blatantly untrue. Initially, the exploitation was in the form of fishing. So there was small scale fishing alongside whaling from 1910 to around 1940, with liver oil being the main target. And then, sorry, I have a bit of a cold, so I'm coughing a little. There was an increase in directed fishing during the wartime. And again, this was primarily for their liver oil, and that oil was used largely in the tanning process. So I found this photo and thought it would be interesting to you folks. This basking shark was hooked in Tramp Harbor. I'm not sure in what year, but it's from the Vashon Heritage Museum archives. So you can see they were coming right down into Puget Sound. Directed fishing wasn't the only source of mortality, though. So from the late 1930s onwards, there was a really highly profitable salmon fishing industry in areas of the coast, and basking sharks started to become entangled in salmon gillnets and seines. So they weren't feeding on the salmon, they were just using the same waters as the salmon, and therefore getting into fisheries interactions. And this resulted in unintentional bycatch, as well as intentional mortality, where fisher folk were, ramming sharks and so on. Sport fishing was also endorsed in the 1940s onwards, and an interesting example up on our coast in Parksville, a town you may have heard of on Vancouver Island. It was actually promoted as the shark fishing mecca of the Pacific Northwest by the Canadian Pacific Railway to try to get tourists out to the island. And it was these fisheries interactions that were the single largest source of human mortality during this time period and into subsequent years. So because they were getting tangled in those gill nets, basking sharks were declared a curse of the fishermen and destructive pests. And by 1948, fishermen were demanding a bounty on basking sharks here in Canada because the sharks were so destructive to their nets. So they were getting tangled up, but interestingly, basking sharks are covered in sort of an anti-fouling slime or mucus, and that can also degrade nets. So they were really quite destructive to the fishing gear. And by 1949, basking sharks had made the Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans list of destructive pests. And this was basically a list, believe it or not, of animals that could be killed on site. by harpooning, shooting, ramming, because they were viewed as impeding economic progress. So basking sharks shared that list with animals like black bears, merganser ducks, kingfishers, seals, sea lions. And by 1955, attitudes were so antagonistic that not just control of basking sharks, but actual eradication was endorsed by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So this part of the presentation is usually quite unbelievable to most, but the most cost-effective method of eradication that was devised by the department, along with ramming, was a large knife that was mounted on the bow of a fisheries patrol vessel called the Comox Post. And you can see it, you can go and see it at a museum in Port Alberni up here. It was a blade used to basically slice and dice basking sharks while they were feeding at the surface. The picture on the right is from a magazine called Popular Mechanic, which actually, depicted this slicing blade. And in the 14 years that it was used in Barkley Sound on our coast, 413 kills were recorded using this device alone. And the quote at the beginning of my presentation was describing the day with the highest number of kills, which was 34 sharks in a single day. So by 1970, the slaughter had ended, basically because basking shark numbers were so low that they were no longer a threat. Between 1920 and 1970, then, in summary, several thousand basking sharks were killed in Canadian waters alone. And it's estimated that the decline of the Northeast Pacific population from pre-exploited numbers has exceeded 90%. We don't know how many basking sharks there are now in the Northeast Pacific population, but it's estimated to be as low as less than 500 individuals based on modeled estimates of population size. And sadly, in terms of recent work, a study published in 2002 of sightings in the California current ecosystem from 1962 to 1918 reported a decrease in sightings around the 1970s and 1980s, and a more than 50% decline in school size from the 1960s to the 1980s. And, this is likely due to a decline in the population. So I think it's evident from those slides that we've made some major mistakes as a society when it comes to basking sharks. And we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. So how do we work together to make things better? Where to from here? First off, for any species suspected of facing extinction risk, it's obviously important that the level of risk be formally recognized in legislation. In Canada in 1910, so 40 years after the end of the war on basking sharks, the basking shark was listed under Canada's Species at Risk Act, or SARA, as endangered. And in 2020, an action plan was published for the species, and that you can see that in the top left. Globally, basking sharks are also protected as well under a number of things. The IUCN, they're listed on Appendix 2 of CITES. And many of the recovery actions listed in current recovery documents, like the action plan, are meant to address current threats. So basking sharks remain vulnerable to a number of things: bycatch and entanglement in fishing gear, largely nets, but they can be entangled in things like pot lines, collision with vessels, both recreational and commercial. And, given that they spend time at the surface feeding, this is a risk. And actually collisions with recreational boats is relatively frequent in the United Kingdom, where basking sharks are more abundant. Illegal harvest is an issue. So this is for fins, for shark fin soup. And that's happening likely outside of the exclusive economic zones of Canada and the US. Fins, a single large fin can be worth up to $57,000 US. So there's a lot of incentive for people to do illegal harvest. And then, of course, changing climate could impact their prey availability as well. In the face of all this, though, I think it's important to focus on the fact that there's a lot that we can do. And a big key to recovery is more research and monitoring. much about basking sharks still remains a mystery, and it's especially hard to study them here in the Northeast Pacific, where they're very rare. This is a slide I use for kids' presentations, but I think it gets the message across. Finding them now is like finding a needle in a haystack, or perhaps Bigfoot. In terms of research priorities, there are many. I've just put two up here: population structure and habitat use. This information is critically important so that we can differentiate actual changes in population size from changes in movement patterns and distribution because of environmental change. And then, of course, if we have more habitat use information, we can more effectively mitigate harm from things like ship strikes and fisheries interactions using things like dynamic ocean management. Some quick, neat research facts. So that slime I mentioned, it can also be used for genetic sampling. And basking sharks are detectable from space using very high resolution satellites. And this is a future direction of work that is currently being explored that might provide us with some interesting information. And you can help. Citizen science sightings are so important. In British Columbia, DFO has a shark sightings network. And in the US, there's also a Basking Shark project, which is a partnership between the Pacific Shark Research Center and the National Marine Fisheries Service. And really, these initiatives are focused on educating and engaging the public. And we want anyone to report who's out on the water or even in the air to keep their eyes peeled. And every report is important, even historic ones. In terms of sightings, I'm just going to take a sip of water and let you take a peek at this. So this is a rough map that I just pulled together on Google Earth showing recent sightings reported to the DFO Shark Sightings Network from 1996 to 2020. The confirmed sightings are the ones in red. So those are based on photo and video ID. And you can see that sightings tend to come in sort of from the west coast of Vancouver Island, but we do get sightings in the Salish Sea, and some pretty exciting ones. Sightings 13 and 14 are two sharks that were spotted in the San Juan Islands area in 2009, right kind of around when I first started studying basking sharks. And sighting 30, way down there, made headlines across the US, and this headline was from Fox News 13. Essentially, what happened is a large shark swam up to a family's boat. And so they turned off their motor and watched in amazement and took photos and then sent those photos to NOAA to confirm the sighting. They knew, as they were watching the shark, that it was a basking shark. But when asked why she sent the photos in, the woman, Grace, she said, "I hope they make people less afraid of sharks." So on that note, I would like to end with a few short ruminations on why the basking shark and protection of the basking shark matter. And I get this question sometimes when out giving presentations, well, that was all in the past and, we can't do much at this point. But there are some really important lessons in the basking shark story that should guide our actions into the future, not just when it comes to basking sharks, but when it comes to anything in nature that we don't fully understand. So for much of the 20th century, we've really viewed basking sharks as at best a nuisance and at worst our enemy. And we've called them all sorts of ugly things. You can read some of them up there: dull and sluggish, clumsy and without spirit, grotesquely huge mammal, inaccurate, salmon killing monster, inaccurate, plankton eating monster seems a bit, I don't know, plankton eating monster, sissies of the shark family. So we've called them horrible things. And these descriptions have influenced our behavior, but also condoned behavior that otherwise would be considered completely abhorrent. We have, though, with greater awareness, come to realize how wrong we were. And it didn't take us that many years you know, it was 70 years really that we've come to realize how wrong we were. And now when basking sharks get media attention, they're certainly depicted more favorably. These are a couple of headlines that I pulled off the internet. Peaceful basking sharks, spectacular. They're referred to as hanging out in family groups. You know, so our descriptions of them have really changed, and how we see them has changed. And when I talk about basking sharks now with adults, with kids, people just can't believe that we ever treated them so horribly. So that, and the enthusiasm, just the general enthusiasm that I'm greeted with when I give these presentations, really gives me hope that we can change. We can recognize the intrinsic importance of species and the complexity of ecosystems. And we can recognize that it's our responsibility to right wrongs of the past, even if this means dealing with challenging interactions into the future. So I think this quote by Carl Safina in one of my favorite books, Song for the Blue Ocean, pretty much sums it up. Which will it be then? Degradation or recovery, scarcity or plenty, compassion or greed, love or fear, ahead to better times or to worse? We will all, by our actions or inaction, help decide. And I, for one, would love for us to redeem ourselves and to see a basking shark or sharks cruising through our coastal waters again. So that wraps up the presentation. If you'd like more information, you can reach out to me directly, and I'm always happy to chat sharks. I have to make mention of a book that a lot of this information was pulled together from, called Basking Sharks, The Slaughter of BC's Gentle Giants, written by two friends of mine, Scott Wallace and Brian Gisborne. And you can Google a couple things, Species at Risk Public Registry, if you want more information on the species at risk strategies and action plans up here, the DFO Shark Sightings Network, and then the Spot a Basking Shark Project. If you happen to spot a basking shark and would like to report it, please do. And this is actually the end. I just wanted to end with another little video. And some of the lovely photos and videos in this presentation are courtesy of the Irish Basking Shark Group, which is doing wonderful work on the other side of the world, where there are still many more basking sharks than there are here.
Beautiful. Thanks, Romney. Are you ready for questions from the
I
room
am.
on Zoom? Okay,
Yes.
perfect.
Should I stop sharing my screen?
Sure. Yeah, then we can
Okay.
see and have a little more of a conversation.
Great.
Awesome. Okay, beautiful. Well, I don't know if it'll pick up on the mic. Do we want to give Romney a round of applause here? And then we'll get to
I can see you clapping, so that's great. Thank you.
Okay, that was vigorous. I will take a few questions from the room here, and then we can head over to Zoom. And Romney, I'll repeat these for you, so there will be a little lag. Yes. Okay, so a question about basking sharks' movement through the ocean and any relationship to ocean health in those spaces.
Sorry, ocean health, did you say?
Yeah, or did you have a more specific dimension of? So the question's focusing on ocean acidification.
Ocean acidification. Well, that's a good question. I mean, the truth is we really don't know much about basking sharks. The tagging studies that I put up there are two of only a handful done worldwide on their movement. We've been attempting to them up here for, well, since around 2009, 2010, but we can't find them to tag them. So there's really not a whole lot of information to go on why they're moving, where they're moving. Certainly, how ocean acidification might be affecting their movement, we have no idea. based on the tagging studies that have been done, it's thought, they're moving into waters to feed. So even though coastal waters at the surface are where there are a lot of copepods at certain times of the year, there's also sort of the deep scattering layer where there's a lot of copepods concentrated. And they could be heading there to feed. As I mentioned in one of the slides, we think that they're probably going into deeper water to reproduce and have their young. One of the reasons we think that is because I mentioned we've only ever encountered one pregnant female, and that's in over 200 plus years of interacting with basking sharks worldwide. So where are they going to have their pups to reproduce? Well, likely into deeper water. But yeah, so how ocean health is impacting basking sharks, I don't think we know those things because we're still in the early stages of finding more about them. We're in a research stage now and not a slaughter stage. So hopefully those questions can be answered in the near future.
Awesome.
I don't know if is that good?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
This is like a very general question, but just like ways, like what are ways that basking sharks can be protected given the fact that they have such a large range spanning like different countries and like international waters? Like what are like ways to protect them through all of those different like political boundaries?
Yes. Given the large geographic range of the sharks, what can be done to help protect them?
Well, that's the $100 million. What's the expression? That is a very good question. I mean, as I noted in one of my slides, for these wide-ranging, highly migratory species, it really comes down to cooperative work across borders, and efforts to do that are increasing. To do research in a cooperative way, share sightings data across borders, things like that, so we can paint a better picture of the basking shark population. But then there's also just things that each country that has basking sharks should be doing. So, we need to work on the genetic side of things. We need to know, is there population differentiation? We need to also determine, where are some of the basking shark fins within the market coming from, because the number of fins showing up in markets doesn't correlate with sort of our CITES numbers. So there's obviously illegal harvest coming in, more work within the markets to kind of figure out how many basking sharks there actually are, where those sharks are coming from. I mean, there's an endless amount of work that can be done when it comes to research, but I think the key point, given that they're so migratory, so widespread, is that there needs to be that collaborative aspect to work. And that can be challenging, for sure.
Yeah, thanks. Do you have any?
Yeah. How do you like protect them?
You can have this.
Okay. How do you protect your satellite and tagging data from poachers or illegal harvesters?
Oh boy, I don't know if I can answer that question. Yeah, I haven't actually been directly involved in any of the basking shark tagging studies, so I'm not sure how they do that. That is an amazing question. Just on the tagging side of things, though, just to give you a little bit of information on the tags, because they're really cool. The tags, they actually, so they're an archival satellite pop-up tag. So what happens is you can program them to release after a certain number of days, and you can get that data in two ways. So if the shark comes to the surface and the tag is, sufficiently out of the water, that data, you can get that data via the satellites. But if the shark never comes to the surface, which, for sharks, that can be the case, the tag is still constantly recording data, and it's programmed to pop off at a certain amount of time. So a little bit corrodes, the tag pops to the surface, and that's when the archived data is transmitted and you can get it. So you don't actually have to recover the tag to get your data, which is a really neat thing when you're studying species that are maybe traveling out to the open ocean and traveling really far distances and so on. So tag technology is really coming along, and it's amazing what we're able to discover using some of these tags. That I know that didn't answer your question, but I thought I'd just give you a little explanation on the tags because it's so interesting.
Thanks. Take a couple more. Yeah.
Company that was trying to develop tags that so be many researchers putting those onto fishing vessels and boats in the area to then like decrease collisions.
Okay, so there are two parts to the question. First being, is there research on basking sharks and electromagnetic signals?
Such into whether that would be
Okay, yeah, so using electromagnetic signals on boats as a way to deter basking shark collisions with vessels.
That is also a question that I am unsure about. You know, I did note that collisions with recreational vessels weren't infrequent in the United Kingdom. So I would hope that, you know, some work is happening maybe over there on how to deter basking sharks from recreational vessels. But I'm not aware of any studies that have looked at that directly for basking sharks. Again, sadly, there isn't a whole lot of work happening on them. I mean, the basking shark global population of researchers is actually quite small, given it is small and surprisingly small, given that this shark is so wide-ranging and big and charismatic. So again, hopefully a lot of this research is coming down the pipes if it's not already happening, and the answers can come forth in the coming years.
So, yeah.
This is more of a personal question, but how did you get into work with basking sharks, considering like you've never seen one?
Yeah. Well, so I've always been fascinated by sharks, and I actually did my master's on the east coast of Canada on skates, flat sharks, woo, in the Canadian Atlantic Shark Research Lab. And on that coast, there are more basking sharks than there are out here. So we actually did some surveys for basking sharks out there. I never saw a live one. I did see a dead basking shark, and that kind of piqued my interest in the species. And then when I moved back out to the West Coast, I got a job working for the Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans as a shark scientist. And that was in 2010, so right the year when basking sharks were listed as endangered under our Species at Risk Act. So there's not a whole lot of shark research happening, you know, up here. But when a species is listed, that results in obviously and hopefully some more work on the species. So that's kind of how I got into the basking shark work, was because it was listed under SARA, and that meant that there were some funds to start looking at the species and trying to do some recovery work. I cannot believe I've never seen one, and it's a life goal to see one, ideally on this coast, but anywhere really. I've spent so many years kind of thinking about them and presenting on them and everything. It seems crazy that I haven't seen one. So my fingers are perpetually crossed that they return to our coast in greater numbers and I'm able to see one.
Got some more questions here.
Are there any animals that prey on basking sharks?
Yeah, so I mentioned in one of the slides, they have a low natural mortality because they're so big. So when they're born, they're what is it? It's like 1.3 to 1.5 meters or something. They're quite big when they're born. So even when they're born, they don't have a whole lot of predators. It's thought that perhaps killer whales prey on basking sharks, especially smaller, younger basking sharks. Maybe sperm whales. We don't really know. Again, if they're traveling to deep depths, perhaps they're preyed on by sperm whales. it's one of these things that we don't really know. The interesting thing is again, to what are they doing in deep waters? We don't often encounter, and this is worldwide, we don't often encounter basking sharks less than 3 meters long. So those juvenile sharks, you know, perhaps are being preyed on by things, but we're just not seeing it. But I think the take-home message is they do have a low natural mortality because they're so big. And so not many natural predators. I will say, though, an interesting theory that's come up recently is that on our coast, we have a type of orca called an offshore orca that they're shark specialists. So they feed almost exclusively, it's thought, on sharks. And one of the theories is that perhaps, you know, when basking sharks were more abundant on the coast, orcas, those offshore orcas would have fed on them. And now those orcas are having to switch to a, you know, smaller prey like six gills and sharks that aren't sort of, for the output of the orca, maybe aren't as energetically beneficial. And so there could be these cascading, we just don't know what the implications of the loss of basking sharks have, what the implications of that loss have been on the ecosystem. But it could be things like those predator-prey interactions, and we just don't know, you know, what the implications have been. So it's an interesting question, yeah.
Time for a couple more from the room. There's Danny. Yeah.
With them being surface feeders and having such a wide mouth, is there issues of them consuming like oceanic pollution that's floating on the surface?
Yeah, so question about given the way that they feed, is there any concern about accidental ingestion of surface pollution, garbage, so on?
Yeah, I would say definitely. I mean, it's not one of the main threats kind of listed in the recovery documents, but it's one that we've thought about for basking sharks for sure. And actually one of the recovery measures in the recovery strategy and action plan for basking sharks speaks specifically to doing some more work on toxicology on these sharks. I mean, they're not top of the food chain like a transient killer whale or something, so they don't get that bioaccumulation of toxins, but they're certainly feeding a lot. They're filtering all that water. You know, toxicology is an avenue that we haven't explored yet with basking sharks, but sure, certainly should, and it's noted in those recovery documents that it's a whole. So yeah.
Thanks.
Have there been like historically any other like I guess oceanic mammals that have had similar experiences with being treated poorly? Like obviously like pollution and stuff, but I'm talking like targeted specifically.
Yeah, are there any other species that have had a history of similar targeting from public policy and governments for eradication?
I mean, the period where we had the eradication program for basking sharks, I mean, it was a pretty kind of sad period for how we viewed a lot of creatures. And really, the view was if it was impeding our economic progress, then it was something that needed to be controlled. And so, I mean, there's lots of examples of poor treatment. Even orca, up on our coast, there was actually a machine gun mounted to fire at orca because of fisheries interactions with orcas. Seals and sea lions, I think, are the classic. In the book that I mentioned, where a lot of this information comes from, there's actually a section that talks about you know, how they would go to sea lion rookeries and haulouts and harbor seal haulouts, and this is horrible, but they would actually explode them. Absolutely unbelievable, but that was the view back then. And so you know, I think the basking shark story is definitely an extreme one, but there were other extremes taken as well against animals that were, you know, seen as impeding our economic progress.
Got it. 1 minute left here. Last question from Liam.
I'm curious what the advocacy campaign or history looked like to get the basking shark covered under the species at risk map.
Yeah, a question about what kind of advocacy occurred to get this listing of the basking shark.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that there wasn't a whole lot. Essentially, what happens up here in Canada is we have something that precedes a legal listing. It's called COSEWIC, Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. And COSEWIC, determines status for species, and then they go through the legal listing process. So for whatever reason, around 2010, well, earlier, because COSEWIC 2010 is when the legal listing happened. I think it was around 2007, perhaps, that the COSEWIC process started, but it was started for kind of all of the Pacific shark species. And so there was no real, that I'm aware of, sort of advocacy or anything saying this species need to be listed. It was sort of sharks came up on the COSEWIC's radar, and then they just sort of went through the process. And that's why a lot of people still don't know about basking sharks, because that education and outreach, it takes time, it takes money, and it just hasn't happened that much for basking sharks up in Canada, in Washington, Oregon. I mean, it's hopefully coming, more outreach and education on sharks, but people still are like, what's a basking shark? So there wasn't a whole lot of advocacy or outreach or education that sort of led to the listing process.
Awesome. Well, thanks again so much, Romney, for your time. We're giving you one more round of applause.
Thank you.
And if folks have further questions, is there a good way we can follow up with you?
Yeah, so like I said, I'm happy to take any questions or comments via email, and I think you guys have that. And then I put in that last slide there a couple of things, but happy to share that too as well. But best way is just send me an email, and I'm happy to answer. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks so much again.
You're very welcome.
Okay,
Yay.
I'll follow up with you via email.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bet.